She said a black kid couldn't have written that, but never expected his essay to reach the New York Times. Mrs. Caldwell didn't even hesitate when she said it. No shame, no doubt. Just a smug little smile, like she'd caught him doing something dirty. Jamal had spent 4 nights writing that paper, 4 nights barely sleeping, pouring everything he had into every line. It was about his grandfather, a sharecropper in Mississippi, who taught himself to read by candlelight and pass that hunger down through generations. The story was personal, raw, poetic. And for the first time, Jamal felt proud to turn something in. Until she read it. She called him up after class, waved the paper like it was a fake ID. "Jamal, I have to ask," she said. "Did you really write this?" His throat tightened. "Yes." Her eyes narrowed. "This doesn't sound like you." He didn't know what to say. What was he supposed to sound like? Then she crossed the line. She said, "Let's be real. Kids like you don't write like this." Kids. Like you. He didn't move. He didn't even blink, because that moment, that quiet little sentence, was louder than anything she'd ever said in front of the whole class. Louder than every side-eye, every microaggression, every time a teacher told him to tone it down or keep it simple. She didn't think he was smart. Not really. Not that kind of smart. And more than that, she didn't want him to be. He looked down at the paper again. She had circled words like resilience, lineage, institutional memory, like they were threats. And to her, maybe they were. Because when a black kid speaks with depth, with clarity, with intellect, it challenges the entire script they've been taught to believe. He wasn't supposed to be exceptional. He was supposed to be quiet, manageable, predictable. But Jamal had already decided. He wasn't explaining himself. Not to her. Not anymore. Because this wasn't just about a paper. This was about every black student who's been told their excellence must be stolen. And Jamal? He was about to prove just how wrong she was, and he knew exactly how to do it. Jamal didn't say a word to Mrs. Caldwell. Not one. He folded the paper in half, tucked it in his backpack, and walked out of that classroom like he was leaving something behind, and he was. That version of himself that needed her approval, gone. Because what she didn't know was that Jamal hadn't just written that essay for class. He'd submitted it to the Voice Rising Project, a national youth writing initiative that spotlighted underrepresented black writers. He hadn't expected much when he sent it in, just hoped someone out there might read it and feel what he felt. But now he needed it to matter. That same night, while Mrs. Caldwell was probably sipping tea and congratulating herself for catching him, Jamal got the email. Subject line, "You're our Spotlight Author of the Month." He stared at the screen in silence, then reread it. Then again, he didn't even smile. Not at first. It wasn't joy he felt. It was validation. Like the world had just confirmed what he already knew deep down, that his voice was real, powerful, and his. The editors had loved his story. They said his words had cut like truth and described his writing as reminiscent of Baldwin's emotional precision. Jamal had to pause. Baldwin? Him? But it wasn't over. The next line in the email nearly made his heart stop. "We've also submitted your essay to the New York Times for potential publication in their Modern Voices section." That was when he stood up from his chair. Slowly, chest rising. She tried to erase him with a red pen. Tried to shrink him down to what she thought a black student should be. But now his words were on the verge of becoming undeniable. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Because the truth wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about letting the truth arrive like thunder, letting it shake the room, letting the system choke on its own arrogance. And it was coming faster than anyone knew. By Monday, the essay had gone live, not in the local school paper, not on some hidden website. In the New York Times. Bold headline, full column. Jamal's name right there in print. His story, his truth, published for the world to see. My Grandfather's Eyes, reading by firelight, was already picking up traction online. People were commenting, sharing, Teachers across the country were reposting it, praising it as required reading. But in room 214, Mrs. Caldwell was still grading papers like nothing had happened. Still believing she'd caught a fraud, Jamal sat quietly at his desk, watching her with a calm that almost scared him. Because he wasn't just sitting on a secret. He was sitting on a bomb, one that could shatter everything she thought she knew about him. Third period. Right before the bell, the principal's assistant knocked on the classroom door, handed Mrs. Caldwell a sealed envelope. She opened it with that same mild, dismissive frown she always wore when she thought something didn't matter, and then her eyes paused. Just for a second. That micro-freeze. The kind of freeze people do when they're reading something they didn't expect. Her lips tightened. The envelope held a printed copy of Jamal's Times essay, along with a note from the district superintendent. One of your students has just made our entire district proud. We'd like you to prepare a short introduction for him at next week's Board of Education meeting. She read the line again and again, then looked up. Her eyes met Jamal's, and this time, the squint was gone, replaced by something else, something twitchy, small. Like she just swallowed something sharp and didn't want to show it hurt. But Jamal? He just tilted his head slightly. Nothing cocky, nothing rude. Just enough to let her know he knew. And that was the real shift. Not the email, not the essay, but that look, that knowing. Because the story wasn't just published now, it was alive. And Mrs. Caldwell was about to find out what it felt like to be a footnote in someone else's rise. The auditorium was packed, not with students, with adults, school board members, principals, parents, local journalists. It was the annual Excellence in Education Night, normally reserved for teachers getting certificates and students who aced their SATs. But this year, the buzz was different. Word had already spread. The Black Kid from Roosevelt High had just been published in the New York Times, and suddenly, everybody wanted a piece of him. Jamal sat in the front row, shirt pressed, tie clean, palms sweating. Not from nerves, from heat, the weight of every word he was about to say. But the real spotlight wasn't even on him yet. It was on Mrs. Caldwell. She had been instructed to introduce him, to stand on that stage, read his name out loud, and tell a crowd of professionals how proud she was. It was silent as she walked to the mic. You could almost hear the paper trembling in her hand. Her usual confidence? Gone. She cleared her throat once, twice, forced a smile, and began reading. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing one of our most gifted writers. A young man whose voice reminds us that brilliance often comes from places we fail to look. It sounded nice. Too nice. Like it was written for a student she had always believed in. But Jamal knew better. So did she. And for the first time, she looked like the student. Rehearsed. Nervous. Unsure. She didn't mention the accusation. Didn't mention the plagiarism claim. But she didn't have to. The silence behind her words screamed it. Jamal stood when his name was called. The applause was loud, yes, but underneath it, you could feel the electricity. This wasn't just a moment of celebration, it was a reckoning. For every teacher who doubted a black student's intelligence because it came wrapped in an accent or slang or skin they couldn't imagine being brilliant. As he walked up to the mic, Jamal didn't look at her, not once. He didn't have to. Because he wasn't here to rub it in, he was here to rise above it. And he was just getting started. He stood at the podium, looking out at the faces, a sea of eyes waiting for the thank you speech they'd seen 100 times. But Jamal wasn't here to play it safe. His voice didn't shake. It didn't stutter. It hit. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, he started, calm, composed. But I need to be honest about something. The room shifted, chairs straightened, eyebrows raised. When my essay was first read, it wasn't celebrated, it was questioned. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because it didn't sound like what some people expect from someone who looks like me. He didn't name her. He didn't need to. Mrs. Caldwell shrank 2 inches without moving a muscle. I was told my voice didn't match my skin, that my vocabulary was suspicious, that someone like me couldn't write something like that. Now it was silent. And I'm not telling you this for sympathy, he continued. I'm telling you this because there are thousands of black students in this country, in this state, maybe even in this room, who are being silenced by low expectations. Not because they're not capable, but because they're not trusted to be brilliant. You could hear a pin drop, then a breath catch, then a quiet from somewhere in the back row. He held up the paper copy of the New York Times essay. This story isn't just about my grandfather. It's about how black excellence has always been overlooked, disbelieved, dismissed. We've had to be twice as good to get half the credit. He paused. But not anymore. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. But he didn't need to. Because the room wasn't just clapping now. They were listening, not out of politeness, but because they knew they were witnessing something rare. A young black man stepping fully into his power, with his truth in one hand and his voice in the other. And Mrs. Caldwell? She clapped too. But it was the slow, shaky kind. The kind of clap that says, I just realized I was part of the problem. And Jamal still hadn't even read a word of his essay out loud yet. Jamal took a breath, unfolded the essay, and placed it gently on the podium. No theatrics, no hype. Just a moment, still, deep, sacred, like he was opening a letter from his ancestors. My grandfather's eyes, reading by firelight. He began. And as soon as the words left his mouth, the room went quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that begs for something louder, the kind that tells you people are hanging on every single syllable. My grandfather was born in a house with no books, not because he didn't want to read, but because books weren't written for people like him. He taught himself to read using grocery lists, church flyers, and eventually the back of a fertilizer bag. He used to say, if you can't find the words, make them up, but never let your mouth stay empty. Jamal's voice didn't break, but it pulsed, strong, controlled, like he was holding the weight of 100 years between his teeth. He read by firelight because that's all they had. And when the fire died out, he would close his eyes and imagine what the next chapter might say. I come from a man who had to invent hope just to survive. The audience was silent, but you could feel them breathing with him. A few heads nodded. One teacher in the back wiped her eyes. When I write, Jamal continued, I write with his eyes. Eyes that never got to finish school. Eyes that saw cotton fields and chalkboards from the outside. Eyes that now live in me every time I pick up a pen. He paused, looked up. So when someone tells me I couldn't have written this, that it's too advanced, too articulate, too polished, what they're really saying is that my grandfather's eyes didn't matter, that his firelight meant nothing. He let the words sit, not rush, not explain. And then he closed the paper. I'm not here to prove I'm smart. I'm here to remind you that black brilliance has always existed, even when nobody was watching. The applause didn't erupt. It built, like a wave, slow, full, emotional. People weren't just clapping, they were feeling it, deep. Because that essay wasn't just about Jamal. It was about every black soul who had to scream through silence just to be heard. The applause faded. People were still wiping their eyes, some whispering things like, that was powerful, and he's going places. Jamal stepped down from the podium and took his seat, calm, composed, but burning inside, not from anger, but from the release. It was done. It was out. The world knew now. But what happened next? Nobody saw coming. Mrs. Caldwell didn't rush out, didn't storm off or hide in the back. She stood up, slowly, walked to the side of the stage where faculty and board members were seated. And she whispered something to the principal. He raised his eyebrows, surprised. She nodded once, and then he handed her the mic. There was an awkward murmur. A few people thought maybe she'd give another intro. But this wasn't scripted. This was raw. I want to say something, she said, her voice thinner now. No performance, just exposed. I've been a teacher for over 20 years, and in that time, I've read thousands of student essays, some brilliant, some struggling, all worthy of being heard. But last week, I failed one. Jamal didn't move. Mrs. Caldwell looked out at the crowd, then directly at him. I didn't fail him on paper. I failed him in perception. I made a judgment that had nothing to do with grammar or structure, and everything to do with bias, mine. Gasps. Small ones, a ripple. I read Jamal's essay and couldn't believe it came from him. Not because it wasn't excellent, but because I was raised and trained in a system that doesn't expect black students to be brilliant without a footnote. That's on me, and it's on all of us. The room was frozen. This wasn't the apology people expected. It wasn't safe. It wasn't PR polished. It was uncomfortably real. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to say this. From now on, in my classroom, brilliance will not need to explain itself, especially not when it comes from someone like Jamal. She handed the mic back and sat down. Not proud, not broken, just exposed. Jamal didn't smile, but he nodded once, because that was real change. Not just for him, but for every student watching. The next morning, Jamal woke up to over 200 notifications on his phone. At first, he thought it was just his friends, maybe a few teachers sharing the video from the school board meeting. But then he saw the tags. NY Times, Blavity, The Root. Dozens of accounts reposting clips from his speech, quoting his words, "Brilliance will not need to explain itself." By noon, it was everywhere. Teachers across the country started assigning his essay in class. Black students were reading it out loud during morning announcements. College professors were tweeting things like, "A high school senior just articulated the legacy of educational bias better than most scholars." But the most powerful part? The DMs. Hundreds of messages poured in. Black students from Chicago, Atlanta, Oakland, Memphis, writing things like, "They said I was too advanced to have done my own science project. My teacher failed me for using complex language too. Thank you. I thought it was just me." Jamal read every one, and for the first time, he felt something stronger than pride. Responsibility. Because this wasn't just about his win anymore. It was about a system that had been gaslighting generations of black brilliance. Shrinking it, suspecting it, silencing it. Even students at his own school started stepping forward. Kids who had been quiet before, kids who had shrugged it off. One girl said she stopped writing poetry in 7th grade because a teacher told her it sounded too adult. Another kid revealed he had been sent to detention for using a word his teacher didn't think he understood. The story wasn't just viral, it was resonating, cracking open doors that had been locked for years. And while the district tried to play catch-up, issuing statements, promising equity training, holding forums, Jamal didn't wait for their approval anymore. He started working on his next essay, not for school, not for college apps, but because he had something else to say. And now, people were finally listening. A week after the board meeting, Jamal received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a DM. A real envelope, hand-addressed, with a return name he didn't recognize. Louis B. Freeman. Inside was a short note, written in careful, almost old-fashioned cursive. "Young man, your words reached me in ways I cannot describe. I knew your grandfather. We picked cotton together, and I want you to know something about him you may not." Jamal froze. He read the letter 5 times before it fully landed. The man who wrote it was 83 years old, still living in Greenwood, Mississippi. And what he said next rewrote the story Jamal thought he already knew. Your grandfather didn't just teach himself to read, he taught others. Late at night after work, under lantern light, he ran a secret literacy circle for black sharecroppers, including me. We called it the Firelight School. No grades, no chalkboards, just freedom. Jamal's hands started shaking. His chest tightened, not from anxiety this time, but from a kind of sacred realization. He used to say, "If they won't open the schools for us, we'll build our own, right here, with stories." The essay he thought he wrote alone wasn't his alone at all. Jamal sat in silence for nearly an hour after that, thinking, remembering that phrase he'd written, "Black brilliance has always existed, even when nobody was watching," wasn't just a clever line. It was history. His grandfather's firelight wasn't just a metaphor, it was a movement, a literal resistance, a defiant act of intellectual survival. And now, that fire had traveled through time, from the cotton fields, through a homemade classroom, through Jamal's mother's lullabies, and into his essay. He wasn't the end of a story. He was a continuation. Later that night, Jamal lit a candle. Not for aesthetic, not for Instagram, but as tribute. He placed it by the window, opened his laptop, and began writing again. Not for a grade, not for a platform, but for the ancestors. Because the firelight hadn't gone out. It had just moved. Weeks passed. The viral buzz faded. The headlines moved on. But Jamal, he was still writing. Not for fame, not for applause, but because something had been unlocked, something ancient, something his grandfather lit decades ago in a field by firelight, and that now burned steady in Jamal's chest. His teachers treated him differently now. So did the students. Not because he became popular, but because he became undeniable. You couldn't shrink someone who had already stepped fully into themselves. He walked through the halls taller. Not arrogant, not loud, just certain. And that certainty made people nervous, inspired, confused, curious. And then something beautiful started happening. Other students started writing, too. A girl who never spoke in class wrote a poem about her father's deportation and read it at assembly. A boy who'd been held back twice shared an essay about surviving foster care. Kids were coming alive. Because one voice can open the door, but a movement is when others walk through it. Jamal was invited to speak at universities, at youth conferences, at libraries named after people who would have once called him too articulate. But no matter where he went, he brought the same message. Believe Black brilliance the first time you see it. And the mic would always go quiet after that. Because it wasn't just a statement. It was a demand, a challenge, a promise. One day, after a community event, a little black boy, no older than 9, walked up to him and said, "You talk like a superhero." Jamal laughed. "I'm not a superhero." The kid tilted his head. "Then why do you make people clap like that?" Jamal crouched down, looked the boy in the eye. "Because I tell the truth, and the truth has power." He didn't need a cape or a stage. He just needed a pen and a voice. Because somewhere, another black kid was being told they were too good to be real, too smart to be trusted, too articulate to be authentic. And Jamal's story? It wasn't about revenge. It was about permission. To be brilliant. Loudly. Unapologetically. Without footnotes or explanation. The firelight wasn't a symbol anymore. It was a torch. And now, Jamal was passing it on. If that ending lit something in you, share this. Black brilliance doesn't need permission. It needs to be seen.